Let us learn all about the different kinds of mate. Okay, so the first one is Anastasia's mate. So in this position, it is black's turn to move and white's king moves to h1. The characteristic of Anastasia's mate is that there's a knight that controls the escape squares for the king, and the rook will deliver the checkmate. And one of the opponent's piece, which is the pawn, blocks the king from escaping. Okay, so how can we do the Anastasia's mate here? It is by capturing the pawn on h2. The king is then forced to capture back the queen, and then rook h6 delivers the mate. The next mating pattern is Arabian mate. So in this position, it is white's turn to move. Okay, so to do that, we need a rook and a knight. Okay, so the first move here for white is to check the king on b6. Okay, of course black cannot go to a5 because the next move will be knight to c6, and then if the king moves to, when the king moves to a4, rook to a6 is checkmate. So the best move here for black is to go to a7, but after king a7, knight to c6 check, and then king to a8. And now here's the Arabian mate. So the Arabian mate is rook to b8. The characteristic of Arabian mate is that there's a knight that protects the rook, the mating piece, and also guards the escape square, which is a7. Okay, so when you see that pattern, that is called Arabian mate. Okay, so the next mating pattern is Balestra mate. Balestra mate occurs when there's a queen and a bishop, okay, that occupies all the escape squares of the king. So there's typically a queen that controls this file and this diagonal, and then the only escape square for the king is this square, right? But the bishop takes care of that, so there will be no escape square for the king. So when black moves bishop to e6, that is checkmate, and that is Balestra mate. Okay, so the next mating pattern is the Blackburne mate. So in this position, we can see that we can sacrifice the knight to let this diagonal open. So how are we going to do that? By moving the knight to h6. So black will capture that knight, and after that, bishop takes h7 is checkmate. So the characteristic of this mate is that there's a bishop occupying this long diagonal here, and there's a knight on the castle position, in front of the castle position of your opponent, and then the mating piece will be the bishop, which is actually being defended by this knight, and there is no escape square for the king. Okay, so the next mating pattern is Damiano's bishop mate. So the mating move here is queen takes f2 checkmate. So this pattern is called Damiano's mate, and the bishop is protecting the queen. Here's another pattern, Damiano's mate in general. So in this position, to deliver the Damiano's mate, we need to sacrifice the rook. Rook to h1 check. The king is forced to capture that. And then queen to h4 check. The king goes back to g1, and now queen to h2 is checkmate, and that is also Damiano's mate. Now, this is the discovered mate. Okay, so to deliver the discovered mate, we need to move the bishop to where? To f8, right? Bishop to f8, that's checkmate because of this discovered attack here. So when the bishop moves, the line of the rook to the king opens, and the king doesn't have any squares to go to, and that's checkmate. Here's another example of discovered mate. Black moves the pawn to b4, and that is checkmate. Okay, because the line of the bishop to the king opens up when black push the b4 pawn. Okay, and there is no escape square for the king. Another type of mate is the counter check mate. Okay, so this is a discovered check, a discovered mate, but at the same time, you are trying to defend your king against a check. That is why it's called counter checkmate. So we retreat our rook to f1 to prevent or to block the check from the black rook on b1, but that discovered attack is actually placing black's king under check, and that is also checkmate because there's no escape square for black's king. Okay, the next mating pattern is double checkmate. Okay, so double checkmate happens when two of your pieces are attacking the king and the king doesn't have any squares to go to. Okay, and it's called a double checkmate. Here's another example of double checkmate. So here the rook moves to d8, which places the king under check twice because of this discovered check here. So black has to deal with the checks, right? And there's no way to deal with both checks. He cannot just block the bishop, the rook, by placing the bishop on f8, or maybe the queen, placing the queen on f7 to block the check from the queen. There's no way to defend that because of the rook and the queen are checking the king at the same time, and that's double checkmate. The next type of mate is back rank mate. So here we can see that white has a weakness on its back rank, so we can capture that rook. We sacrifice our queen, the bishop captures, and then we can checkmate by placing the rook on e1. That's checkmate. Another type of mate is edge pin mate. By sacrificing the queen, the rook is forced to capture back, and now that rook is under pin, so we can checkmate the king by placing the rook on d8. The rook cannot retreat because of this pin, so that is checkmate. Here's another example of the edge pin mate. Rook to d1 is checkmate. The bishop cannot capture because the queen is actually pinning the bishop against the king. Another example, rook takes h2, king takes h2. Now rook to h5 is checkmate because the knight is being pinned by the bishop, so the knight cannot capture the rook, and the king cannot go to g1 because there's a queen right here. Okay, the next mating pattern is queen cut-off mate. So in here, this is a mate in 1, queen to d1 checkmate. So that is the queen cut-off mate. The characteristic is that when the king is trapped on the back rank and there's no escape square for the king, the queen cuts off. It could either be from the diagonal, or maybe from the file, or maybe from the other diagonal. When the queen cuts off here next to the king with a square space, with a space in between, and the king is being blocked by its own pieces, you see these two pawns here, then that is called the queen cut-off mate. Okay, the next mating pattern is side file mate. So we can capture the pawn on h7. After the king captures, rook to h6 is checkmate because white's pieces are blocking its king, and there's no escape square for the king, so that's checkmate. The next type of mate is smothered mate. So smothered mate is when black tries to sacrifice the queen, so white is forced to capture that with the rook. Of course, he cannot capture with the king because of the knight. And when white captures with the rook, then knight to f2 is checkmate. Here's another scenario for smothered mate. So in this case, black can capture on h2 first. So check. So black is forcing white to capture with the bishop, and after that, again, knight f2 is checkmate because white's pieces are actually blocking the king from escaping, preventing the king from escaping. Okay, so the next mating pattern is suffocation mate. Okay, so what is suffocation mate? When white captures knight or the queen on e7, that is a check, and the king is suffocated. Even though he has lots of pieces surrounding him, that actually contributed to its suffocation because the king is suffocated with its own pieces. He doesn't have any escape squares. There is one supposed to be, but that is being occupied by or being guarded by the bishop on d3. So knight takes e7 is checkmate because the king is suffocated. Okay, so the next type of mate is the epaulet mate. The epaulet mate is when the queen checks on the king and the king doesn't have any squares to go in this pattern. Okay, so there's a king and there are his own pieces are blocking him on the side, and the queen is checking him directly along the rank or maybe file, and the queen is actually guarding the diagonals adjacent to the king, and there is no escape square to go to. So that is epaulet mate. Okay, so here the next mating pattern is called escalator mate. So escalator is a stair that moves, right? So like an escalator, the queen forces the king to go down or to go up, and then queen to d1 forces the king to move down again, and then here's the mate, queen to e2, checkmate. Okay, so escalator mate happens when the queen and the bishop works together, forcing the king to move up or down the board and mating him in an ideal square. Okay, so here's another example of the escalator mate that forces the king to go down further, and then this move forces the king to go back up, right? And then check again, we'll go there, and then here, and then there, and then go back to g1, and now this is checkmate. Okay, so the next mating pattern is called Greco's mate. The characteristic of Greco's mate is that there's a bishop occupying this diagonal, and there's a queen or maybe a rook that will give the check along the open file. So that is Greco's mate. The next mating pattern is called hook mate. Hook mate happens when the king is mated by the rook, which is being defended by the knight, and the only escape square for the king is also being guarded by the knight. So the characteristic is that there's a knight, okay, and there's a rook, and the king is quite hooked. It's like a hook, right? That's why it's called hook mate. So the king is mated by the rook, which is being guarded by the knight, and the knight is being guarded by the pawn or maybe other piece, maybe a bishop or a queen, okay? And the escape square by the king is being guarded by the knight, okay? The next mating pattern is the kill box mate. So the kill box mate happens when there's a queen, okay, and a rook that checks the king from this side, and the king doesn't have any squares to go to. So when you see this pattern, this is called kill box mate. Okay, so the next mating pattern is called the lawn mower mate. So when you when you mow your lawn, you tend to do it by file by file or row by row, right? So in this case, row by row, we check the king, and when he goes down there, we can checkmate him like a lawn mower, okay? That's why it's called lawn mower mate. The next mating pattern is called Lawless mate. So this happens when this pawn right here in front of the king is pushed, and we can just simply place the queen here, queen g7, checkmate. That pattern is called Lawless mate. Okay, so the next mating pattern is called monorail mate. This is somehow similar to lawn mower mate, but in this case, the rook forces the king to move further and further into the edge. So the queen will check here, the king will, okay, so after rook to e6, the king moves here, and then queen to this square will force the king to move here, and then another check here from the rook, the king moves here, and then the final check will be here from the queen. That is checkmate. The next mating pattern is Morpheus mate. So in this scenario, there's a bishop controlling this long diagonal, and there's a rook covering that bishop, and then there's a discovered attack by moving the rook. So that is a check, okay, and the only defense by white here is to put his rook, but that will just be captured, and that's checkmate, and that pattern is called Morpheus mate. Okay, so the next mating pattern is called the opera mate. The opera mate is when there's a bishop controlling this diagonal, and the rook can go to that square, and the king doesn't have any squares to go to. Okay, so that pattern is called opera mate. Okay, so the next mating pattern is called the pawn mate. So in this scenario, f4 checkmates the king. That is called the pawn mate. There's no escape square for the black's king here. Another type of mate is promotion mate. So in this case, f8 queen is checkmate. Okay, so when white promotes its pawn to queen, it checks the king on the back rank, and that's checkmate. Okay, so here's another example of promotion mate. In this case, white promotes its pawn to knight instead of a queen to deliver a check. And fortunately, there's no square for the black king to go to, and that is checkmate. Okay, so the next type of mating pattern is the Pillsbury mate. Pillsbury mate happens when we have a rook here that checks the king along the open file, and there's a bishop that restricts the king from moving to the diagonal. So that's called Pillsbury's mate. Okay, so the other type of mate is the queen and knight mate. So it happens when we have a powerful knight outposted on the front of the king, castle position, or even if it's not castle, if it's positioned like this, and the queen checks, the king goes there, and the queen mates on g7. Okay. The next mating pattern is railroad mate. Railroad mate happens when we have queen and rook combination. Queen to e2 check forces the king to go back, and then rook to c4 check, move back further, queen to c2 check, and then after that we can checkmate the king by capturing the pawn on a4. That's checkmate, and that is called the railroad mate. Okay, so the next mating pattern is called the swallow's tail mate. So swallow's tail mate happens when the queen checks on the king and the king's tail, okay, are occupied by its own pieces, or there are pieces at the back diagonal of the king. That's called swallow's tail mate. Okay, so here the next mating pattern is called threading the needle mate. So you see the king here is trapped, and it only needs a check from the bishop. Bishop to c1 check, there's no escape square because the pawns are occupying those squares, and the king cannot actually go there because it's still under check by the bishop, and the king is actually guarding this square. So that is threading the needle mate. Here's another example. Queen b5 check, that's checkmate. There's no escape square for the king. Okay, so the next mating pattern is the Boden's mate. So how are we going to deliver the Boden's mate here? Boden's mate is when a bishop works with another bishop to deliver the mate. So the bishop is this dark squared bishop is controlling this diagonal. So all we need to do is to add another bishop to checkmate the king. So this is called a Boden's mate. Another type of double bishop mate is this when we capture the pawn here, and this bishop is controlling the long diagonal, and the other bishop delivers the checkmate. Okay, black can do something like this, but after bishop takes e6, it's checkmate. The next mating pattern is called dovetail mate. Okay, so how do we deliver dovetail mate? So it is by checking the king along the diagonal. Okay, and in this case, the escape squares, the escape rank and file is being occupied by its own pieces, and he cannot escape on diagonals because the queen is actually guarding those. Okay, dovetail mate can also happen even if there are no pieces that blocks the king. Like in this case, the king doesn't have any of its own piece that blocks the rank and file, right? But when the queen moves here, the bishop, the white's bishop is actually controlling these squares, so that delivers the checkmate. Okay. Another mating pattern is called the triangle mate. It is when the king is being trapped by the rook and the queen, and the king doesn't have any square to go to because the square next to it is being occupied by its own piece. Okay. Okay, so the next pattern is called Bukowski mate. So it happens when the king is trapped by the rook and the knight at the center in this manner. Okay, so there's a knight here, and the rook delivers the checkmate. The king cannot go here because of the knight. The king cannot go there because of the knight, and the rook is being guarded by the pawn. Okay. The next mating pattern is walking the plank mate. So in this case, this is a pawn mate actually. Black pushes the pawn on f6, that is check. The king is forced to go move up, and then the mate will be delivered by the pawn on h-file. h5 is checkmate. Okay. Okay, so the next mating pattern is called the X-ray mate. So by moving the queen to c3, that is X-ray mate. Actually, the king could have could be free to capture this this rook here, right? But because of the X-ray effect of the move queen to c3, it doesn't only deliver the check, but also defends the rook in spite of the king being in between them, and that mate is called X-ray mate. Here's another example of X-ray mate. So the king is free to capture the rook, right? But bishop to d5 delivers a check, right? And also defends the rook, because the king cannot capture the rook because that is being guarded by the bishop. Okay.